There once was a man living in ancient Athens known over the course of history as Diogenes the Cynic. The key thing to understand about Diogenes is that he did things a little bit differently than the standard philosophers, both of the modern day and of ancient times. He's probably most known throughout history for his strange and some would say shameless behavior. And when Diogenes was at peak Diogenes, he would probably be best described in the modern day as some sort of boorish homeless man. He had very few possessions. He lived in a tub. Some people called it a wine jar. He spent most of his day in the nude, basking in the sun. He was known for jeering and insulting passersby as they walked past him. There are some documented stories of Diogenes urinating both in public and on public individuals. He believed in satisfying his basic human needs in public. I'll let you figure out what that means on your own. But the point is, Diogenes was unusual and bizarre even for the time period. But despite being unusual and bizarre, Diogenes is one of the most well-known and influential philosophers in all of history. Diogenes essentially unknowingly founded an entire branch of philosophy known as Cynicism. He advocated for ideals and values that many should and do still find valuable today. And I think that looking at Diogenes and studying what he was all about can teach us some important lessons, both for the study of history and for navigating the modern world that we live in. Before we get into Diogenes and some of the things that he was all about and cynicism and how it all connects together, you sort of have to take everything about Diogenes and about the early Cynics with a grain of salt. This tends to be the way it is with a lot of ancient history, because a lot of the writings and a lot of the primary artifacts that these people were creating at the time haven't survived throughout history. So a lot of times we are relying on accounts that come decades or even centuries later talking about these people. So in the case of Diogenes and the old Cynics, this is probably 4th century BC or even later. Much of the writings that Diogenes wrote or people writing about Diogenes have not survived. We do have writings from Aristotle that references Diogenes. We do have writings that come a few centuries later. We do have stories that have been handed down. And it seems like we have a pretty good handle that this guy Diogenes did exist. And much of what is written about him is, if not true to the exact letter of every single fact, at least true to the extent that something like what is referenced in whatever story about Diogenes they're talking about almost certainly happened. So with that out of the way, Diogenes was born in 410 BC in the city of Sinope on the Black Sea. Early on in his life, it's unclear whether it was Diogenes himself or Diogenes' father, but most people think that Diogenes' father committed bank fraud, probably some sort of scheme to deface the currency. And as a result of that, Diogenes was exiled, and eventually after a period of wandering, he ends up in Athens, where he kind of takes up this persona as the boorish homeless guy, like we said. It's interesting that Diogenes gets exiled for supposedly defacing the currency, or supposedly his dad did that, but it's sort of a metaphor for what Diogenes would ultimately become known for, because he was ultimately known as someone that was going to deface the corrupted values of the people of Athens and really humanity in general. So much of the mission of Diogenes was to show people that the lifestyle that they were living and the values that they found important were actually absurd and corrupted. Some historians think that the virtues that Diogenes learned when he was in exile, stuff that he had to develop or else not survive, stuff like toughness and resilience and overcoming adversity and minimalism. These became themes that Diogenes was preaching to the people of Athens as a replacement for the focus on wealth and material possessions that Diogenes felt the people of Athens were being corrupted by. So eventually Diogenes makes it to Athens and he begins living this life that we talked about, where he's living in a tub and he's pointing out to people the absurdities of their lifestyles and their existence, and he's promoting his own sort of philosophy, which would eventually become what's known as Cynicism. And you would think the people of Athens would be appalled by this naked guy in a tub cracking jokes and using dirty humor and insulting people as they pass by. You think the people wouldn't like that, but it turns out the people of Athens actually loved him. Classicist and historian Robert Dobbin says, quote, "Diogenes traveled a fair bit, but his home was in Athens, and the Athenians, despite his gruff demeanor, took him to their collective heart. He became one of the city's favorite characters, and when his tub broke, the city voted to replace it at public expense." End quote. It seems like the common people of Athens tended to enjoy Diogenes and his particular brand of humor and philosophy, but Diogenes' contemporaries, both in philosophy and in politics, oftentimes didn't appreciate what he did. Diogenes was sort of at the peak of his philosophical powers shortly after the time of Socrates. He was a contemporary of Plato and later Aristotle, and neither man seemed to have too much love in their hearts for Diogenes. Aristotle references Diogenes as the dog, which was supposedly his nickname. This nickname was probably meant as an insult for his bizarre and shameless behavior. Again, the stuff like urinating in public or not wearing any clothes or living in a tub. But in what might seem like sort of a strange move, Diogenes embraced the nickname and came to call himself that. Historian Robert Dobbin talks about why Diogenes might have embraced the nickname of the dog. Quote, "Perhaps his motive in accepting the insult was to neutralize it through a defiant act of appropriation. But there were other reasons that, owing in part to his own complacence, the label stuck. Diogenes admired the honesty of dogs. They were shameless in demonstrating their obvious fondness or antipathy towards certain people. They survived on very little, though in this they could hardly be less like Diogenes' fellow Athenians, most of whom, it seemed, could never get enough of anything. Most of all, Diogenes professed to have, and be ready to share, the secret to that most elusive of blessings, simple contentment. Dogs, with their buoyant spirit, in the company of their masters, taking part in the hunt, subsisting on only one meal a day, with water alone to wash it down, were evidently happy creatures. Why are humans, with our far greater resources, so often not? The solution, in part, was obvious. Take a lesson from dogs and other beasts and the simplicity of their existence, and rely on nature to provide a sufficiency of life's essentials. Not that this could be accomplished overnight. Through training, we first have to cure ourselves of our greedy, pampered habits." End quote. For Diogenes, if some of these more sophisticated philosophers wanted to call him the dog, he was fine with it. He seemed to have adopted it, and he admired dogs. He admired the simple pleasures of life. He didn't need the extra bells and whistles to be happy, and he believed in leading a simple and content life in harmony with Mother Nature and human nature. And that's exactly how Diogenes lived. He had no clothes. Supposedly he had one cloak that he used to set on the ground when he needed to go to sleep. He lived in a tub or a wine jar. He had a knapsack with a bare minimum of possessions. And his idea of rest and relaxation was lying in his tub and sunbathing. When he wasn't doing that, he was walking from place to place, engaging in philosophical conversations, or cracking jokes and insulting passersby. While this might not seem like it's a noble calling for a sophisticated philosopher, there's actually a lot of depth to what Diogenes was doing and what he was saying and what he was trying to get people to understand. So much depth, in fact, that he basically inspired an entire school of philosophy known as Cynicism, or the Cynics. Now, from a philosophical standpoint, cynicism is probably not what you think it is. In the modern day, we tend to think of people who are cynical as people who are often pessimistic and negative and angry and oftentimes unhappy. I think there's sort of a negative connotation to the word cynical that might cloud people's judgment when we talk about what cynicism really means. Philosopher Luis Navia does a good job of explaining the difference between what we think of with modern cynicism versus philosophical cynicism. Quote, "The presence of Diogenes, that is, the meaning of cynicism in the classical sense, can best be appreciated by considering the wide gap that separates the example of his life and his ideas from those of his descendants of modern times. The new cynics are related to the old cynics only through a linguistic perversion of the original name. In this way, cynicism became cynicism, and the cynics were changed into cynics or cynical people. The latter turned out to be the very antithesis of the former. The new cynic, the ugliest man, as Nietzsche referred to him, is the reverse of Diogenes, neither with respect to convictions and ideals, nor in the way in which life is lived, is the new cynic the rightful descendant of his cynic ancestors. Since his ubiquitous presence seems to be today the standard by which all things are measured, there should not be, therefore, anything surprising in the fact that the human world at the beginning of the 21st century is truly bankrupt from a moral point of view, for the new cynic has no moral point of view. There is no trace of conscience in him. Equipped with the tools of a technology that lacks direction and empowered by its achievements, the new cynic cynically rules as an unchallenged monarch. He is the king. By lineage, he is not related either to Diogenes or to Socrates, but to the troglodytes of prehistoric ages from whom he has inherited their immeasurable mindlessness, vulgarity, and greed. He lives his meaningless life either watching television, the images of which he mistakes for reality, or conquering nations and decimating populations in the vain quest for oil or some other source of wealth. As a perfect narcissistic solipsist, he cares for nothing and nobody, but only for himself." End quote. Okay, that was a long quote, and ironically, some might view that as a cynical quote in its own way, but it does a good job of explaining what philosophical cynicism is and is not. Mostly what it is not. So it's not that person who's just constantly always pessimistic and critical and only looking out for themselves and doesn't have any sort of moral code or moral value. That's not cynicism, even though that's kind of what the word has come to mean in the modern era. So that, of course, begs the question, what is cynicism? It seems that cynics have a whole hodgepodge of values and beliefs, and sometimes it can be complex to merge it all together, but in general, cynics believe that moral virtues are more or less equitable with happiness. So the goal of a good cynic life would be to live a happy life. They also believe in other values like justice and self-control, even something Plato would value like wisdom, and plenty of other non-traditional values: self-sufficiency and minimalism, freedom, detachment. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy expands on what the cynics mean by detachment. Quote, "Counseling the simple and uncomplicated satisfaction of one's natural instincts and desires, Diogenes urges detachment from those things held out by convention to be good. While he is not so explicit, others develop the theme of detachment into the notion of tranquility. The Stoics and Epicureans hold that happiness depends on detachment from vulnerable or difficult to obtain bodily and external goods and consists in a psychological state more under one's own direct control." End quote. So it's kind of talking there about how the Cynic school and Diogenes influenced later schools of philosophy like Stoicism and Epicureanism, but this idea of detachment is important. It's not that you don't care, it's that you're finding a more tranquil mental state, Perhaps you're suspending immediate judgment on people, and you're trying to detach from the material world that seems to be consuming everybody else. In addition to detachment, the Cynics also believed in mental and physical training your body and your mind and even your spirit. So moral toughness and endurance were something that were important to the Cynics, overcoming adversity and overcoming obstacles. In a way, something related to this is trying to reduce your material needs and your possessions and the desire for fame and wealth, understanding that these things have no purpose in nature. So if you're trying to live a simple life in accordance with nature, why pursue them and why care about them? Classicist and historian Robert Dobbin does a nice job of summarizing some of the Cynic values and some of the values that Diogenes stood for. Quote, "They certainly stood by happiness as their professed telos, life in agreement with nature, as they understood the phrase conduced to freedom, self-sufficiency, and the rest of the distinctive values that they saw as the constituents of happiness. We can go further and say that the Cynic life was a shortcut to virtue, inasmuch as it presupposed a measure of self-control, of justice, and of bravery, in that they submitted to a preliminary course of training and developed exceptional endurance." End quote. It's also important to note that the Cynics had these values and beliefs, but they didn't spend a great ton of time analyzing them. The idea was just to live a virtuous and happy life based on self-control and self-sufficiency and freedom and mental and physical training, but they didn't sit here and pontificate on it too much or develop these big treatises and write everything down and so on and so forth. They felt that wisdom for the sake of gaining knowledge or just knowledge for knowledge's sake was useless unless you're applying it. So the Cynics weren't big into metaphysics and the nature of reality or speculative philosophy. They had no school building like Plato would have had. They had no official meeting spot. The streets of Athens were the training ground for the Cynics. A great Diogenes story that sort of illustrates this point is the difference between Diogenes and Plato. So Plato is more about the ideals and the forms and pontificating on these big ideas, whereas Diogenes was more grounded in the real world. So supposedly Plato had defined a human being as an animal that was bipedal, walking on two legs, and featherless. And supposedly he was applauded by all the school of Athens and the philosophers around. And Diogenes being Diogenes, he goes out, he plucks a fowl of all its feathers, he brings it into the school where Plato is, and he says, "Here is Plato's man." Basically taking this skinned bird and parading it around, kind of shoving it in Plato's face. There's a humorous element to it, but he's also illustrating this point about practicality versus idealism. And just as an aside there, Cynics that follow Diogenes, and of course Diogenes himself, seemed to have no problem with berating others and sort of insulting them as they went on, and this was all part of the Cynic persona. So they would wear these long, untrimmed beards and hang out on the street corners and sort of try to expose the people of the cities that they lived in for the contradictory and virtueless life that these people were living, at least according to the Cynics. All of these extra bells and whistles and the focus on materialism and the focus on fame and power and glory were something that the Cynics were openly adamant about criticizing. Ultimately, with Cynic philosophy, I think it's tough to pin down, like many of these complicated philosophies with different interpretations and different people who have different schools within the school and so on and so forth. But I think there's a couple of key Cynic themes and key Cynic values that percolate throughout Diogenes' life and the life of the ancient Cynics, and these guys inspired future schools of philosophy and historians and thinkers for generations. One of the key themes of Cynicism is freedom of speech. Supposedly, Diogenes said that this is the most valuable thing in the world. And a great Diogenes story that illustrates his commitment to freedom of speech is the story with him and Alexander the Great, which is also probably the most famous Diogenes story. Allegedly, Diogenes was out doing what he normally does, sunbathing in his tub near the city of Corinth, and Alexander the Great was in town. Alexander had heard about Diogenes and probably was curious, or maybe he just wanted to go pay a visit to him, and he gets to Diogenes and he introduces himself. He says, "I'm Alexander the Great." Diogenes responds with, "I am Diogenes the dog." Alexander, perhaps getting a kick out of the conversation already, sort of asked Diogenes, "Is there anything I can do for you? Keep in mind, I am the king, I'm the great conqueror, I'm one of the greatest humans to have ever lived at this point in world history." So Diogenes responds to this great man asking what sort of favor he can do for him, and he says, "Get out of my light. You're blocking the sunlight, get out of the way." Alexander, probably baffled at this point, but maybe sensing the humor of Diogenes, says, "If I were not Alexander, I should wish to be Diogenes." And then Diogenes says, "If I were not Diogenes, I should also wish to be Diogenes." The story here is famous and it's funny, and like all good stories, it probably never happened. So historians have looked at sort of the positioning of who Alexander was at that particular time in history, where he would have been, and where Diogenes would have been, and there's a very slim chance that this meeting actually ever happened, but the story illustrates a couple of key themes about Diogenes and about the Cynic school of thought. To Diogenes, freedom of speech was absolutely critical, and in particular, the freedom of speech to criticize authority. Diogenes had no desire to cozy up to authority figures, and he felt it important to be critical of these figures and at times even insulting and insolent. This is interesting for a lot of reasons. So in modern society, we, in many places, champion free speech as being probably the most important value in a democratic society. But back in the day, in ancient society, that almost certainly wasn't the case. So Diogenes was ahead of the curve there, but he was also ahead of the curve as far as thinking that criticizing authority figures is something that's important in a functioning and fair society. Very famously, some of the other important philosophers of the time tended to cozy up to authority figures, whether it was tutoring them or developing relationships with them or hanging out at the courts. A lot of times, some of the more well-known philosophers would cozy up to these authority figures, not Diogenes and not the Cynics. Robert Dobbin comments on this saying, quote, "As a rule, ancient thinkers cultivated the patronage of rulers, either as a means to get official support for their philosophy or simply to provide themselves with food and shelter, philosophy not being a particularly lucrative profession. Plato was intimate with the tyrant Dionysius of Syracuse and his son. Xenophon attached himself to Cyrus the Younger. Aristotle tutored Alexander the Great in his youth and remained a regular at the Macedonian court for the rest of his life. So far from seeking such alliances, the Cynics seem to have actively alienated the political powers that be." End quote. Now, if you believe this story about Diogenes and Alexander, sort of the end of the story is that Alexander is humored by Diogenes, and in a way, Diogenes earns Alexander's respect. But of course, as we know, other leaders throughout world history don't respond very well to criticism. Oftentimes, being critical of authority figures in history leads to devastating consequences and unthinkable calamities. And even in everyday personal life, speaking freely, criticizing authority, seeing things as they are, and saying things as they are can lead to bad results, unfortunately. Philosopher Luis Navia says, quote, "Oscar Wilde once said that cynicism is the art of seeing things as they are instead of as they should be. In his insistence on defining philosophy as the practice of calling things by their right names, Diogenes stands in agreement with Wilde. If nothing else is to be done today with Diogenes, we could conjure his ghost from the remote past to remind ourselves that reality is not what the governing oligarchies want ordinary people to accept, or what flows so abundantly from the media, or what those whom we call celebrities peddle in the public light, or what the endemic inertia of the human mind sanctifies, but the truth that things and situations speak out for themselves. Diogenes can teach us to see the human world precisely as it is, without distortions, euphemisms, or deceptions." End quote. There it is, a crucial element to the life of Diogenes and one of the crucial values to the philosophy of the Cynics: speak freely and question authority. And in the modern day, that authority is not just the government, but it's also mass media and social media and teachers and stuff you read on the internet and authority figures. I think Diogenes would have a lot to say about the world we live in today. The next Cynic value that Diogenes illustrated so well was self-sufficiency. So for Diogenes, he didn't own many possessions. He didn't have a house. He didn't have any sort of transportation. He didn't have any of the bells and whistles that many Athenians at the time had. He owned a cloak, a knapsack with some bare essentials, and a walking stick. Supposedly, he also owned a bowl to drink water and soup from, but one day he saw a kid drinking water with his hands, kind of cupping his hands, and after he saw that he no longer had any need for a bowl. In the modern day, we might call this minimalism, and I think it would do everybody good to look at the example of Diogenes, because minimalism seems to be making some sort of comeback in the modern day in the age of the smartphone and social media and constant stimulation and everybody constantly monitoring their screen time. You know, it sort of reminds you of the old Taoist saying, to gain wisdom, add something every day. To gain enlightenment, lose something every day. But while Diogenes was losing possessions, he was actually gaining mental and physical toughness. So another one of the Cynic values is the idea of mental, physical, and moral training. So Diogenes would walk extreme distances. He would go barefoot. It was said that he rolled around in scalding hot sands, sort of testing the limits of human endurance. When you've put yourself in extreme situations and managed to overcome those extreme situations, then you know that when the next bout of hard times hits, you're going to be able to survive and you're going to be able to thrive. Robert Dobbin comments on this saying, quote, "Hardships involving the loss of familiar physical comforts, to which chance subjects the majority of men at one time or another, had to be tolerable and nothing to fear." End quote. It might seem obnoxious to go walk around barefoot just to provide yourself with some adversity, or to go roll around in scalding hot sands just to sort of test the limits, but it might not be that obnoxious. Modern day Harvard geneticist and aging expert David Sinclair from Harvard has said that testing your body can be a good thing, whether it's going hungry for periods of time or being out of breath or having extreme physical exercise. These can all be healthy things because adversity in this sense can be good. Your body learns to overcome it and you're better off in the long run. And surprise, surprise, it's said that Diogenes lived until past 90 years old. Could be a coincidence, but maybe not. It sort of demonstrates that Cynic value of endurance and self-control and perseverance, where greed and the desire for power are seen as weaknesses. The desire for fame and fortune and things like that make you, for lack of a better word, soft, whereas physical and mental training, endurance, make you better able to endure. So for the Cynics, it was more about enduring hardships, staying the course, than it was about dramatic victories or impressive one-time feats of courage. It's not a surprise that the Cynics admired the story of the Odyssey. They loved Odysseus and all the trials that he went through and how he was able to overcome them in the end. I guess that ending depends on your perspective, but we're not really going to go into the Odyssey here. And this is often interpreted in modern society as a sign of weakness. And even in the ancient world, it was seen as a sign of weakness. So service to society often comes with having criticisms and having hardships and having to endure all sorts of events that are going to be bad for you. But if you can overcome them, you're going to be better in the end. And it's not always the dramatic, courageous, one-time victory over these hardships, but more the slow, gradual enduring over time. That's what's admirable to a cynic. Another Stoic value that Diogenes promoted was that of toughos. So what toughos means is smoke or vapor. It's sort of a metaphor for materialism as a smokescreen for happiness. So we should be a little bit pessimistic and a little bit cynical about the world. Oftentimes what authority figures or what pop culture or what social media is telling us is often a smokescreen for what's really happening under the surface. I think that all of these qualities that we've gone over with the Cynics are important to the study of history, whether it's being self-sufficient, enduring adversity, looking at different people's perspectives, trying not to be sucked in by pop culture and what other people are telling you, trying not to be sucked in by what authority figures and government figures tell you, looking at things in a different way, perhaps, than what's been told to you all your life. These can be valuable tools for the historian, and particularly that element of endurance where it might take a while to get at what is really happening under the surface, and it's going to be difficult to do, but in the end, hopefully it's worth it. Another element of Cynic philosophy, and Diogenes in particular, at least according to classical historian and expert Philip Bozeman, is the idea of using humor, theater, and satire to get a point across and to persuade an audience, also to subvert norms. Here's Bozeman talking about the relationship between Diogenes and this element of theater that seems to be something that has stuck with the story of Diogenes for all of history. Quote, "The theatricality of his self-presentation is nonetheless striking. Firstly, the extent to which the philosopher is depicted in public spaces is of itself remarkable. He is seen as frequenting temples, halls, lecture rooms, theaters, stadiums, gyms, and marketplaces. Secondly, some stories reflect an explicit theatrical approach." End quote. The point being that Diogenes enjoyed having an audience, and without an audience, Diogenes' humor and his sort of biting sarcasm and his ability to push the boundaries of the conventional would not have been as useful. Almost like a good stand-up comedian, there was usually biting and humorous social commentary that Diogenes was putting out there. He had no issue calling out public figures or just people walking by. Some of his one-liners are legendary. Philip Bozeman talks about some of these, saying, quote, "The cynic deliberately disorganizes the unified view of the social system and hierarchies of power. Humor serves as the ideal vehicle for conveying the resulting incongruity, while also suggesting an alternative, more profound truth. When asked what animal he would regard to have the worst bite, he answers, of wild animals, the sycophant, of tame ones, the flatterer. When temple officials let off a person they caught stealing a bowl, Diogenes observed, the big thieves leading the small, suggesting the criminalization of religious institutions generally regarded as fundamental to structured society." End quote. Diogenes used humor, and he used it effectively, but a lot of times there was also an underlying ethic or an underlying value underneath. In one story, Diogenes watches this little kid throwing stones into a crowd. Diogenes knew that this kid was a son of an adulterer, and as the kid was throwing stones into the crowd, he said, "Be careful, you might hit your father." On the one hand, it's funny, and you get the sense that Diogenes was enjoying the biting humor of it, but you might also sense that he might pity this kid, and he might be making this social commentary about this poor kid who's kind of on the streets and he doesn't have a family and so on and so forth. You get the sense when you read more about Diogenes that underneath all of the bizarre behavior and the jokes and the humor and the biting sarcasm and the strange behavior in public and the nakedness and all that crazy stuff, underneath all that, he cared. And you have to care if you want your philosophy to mean anything. Philip Bozeman says, quote, Diogenes managed to make an impact on the philosophical and social scene because of a rare ability to marry not only seriousness with the comic, but also abuse and congeniality. End quote. He's basically saying there that Diogenes on the outside was this sort of biting comedian, but on the inside he was trying to get across a agenda and a belief system that he truly believed in and that he truly thought was going to make everybody better. And in many ways, Diogenes succeeded wildly by living a life that challenged the norms and the styles of the people in power and the popular culture at the time. He did everything he could to try to show the world that the values and the morality and the lack of substance that the world seemed to be living in was not good. Diogenes inspired the Cynic school of philosophy, but he was also revered by many other schools of philosophy. The early Christian church seemed to admire him a little bit. Philosophers of Stoics and Epicureans revered Diogenes. He did get his fair share of criticism as well, but overall the legacy of Diogenes is still with us today. And you can't help but think if Diogenes was still around today, he would have a lot to say, and the world would be very interested in what Diogenes would have to say. It was said that Diogenes spent a lot of his time with a torch lamp, walking around cities, walking around ancient Greece, supposedly trying to illuminate an honest man, a single honest man. He never found that man, and something tells me in the modern day he wouldn't have any better luck. Ultimately, when Diogenes had cracked his last joke, insulted his last passerby, and peed on his last tree, when he was dead, the city of Corinth put up a statue in his honor, and underneath the statue it read, quote, Even bronze groweth old with time, but thy fame, Diogenes, not all eternity shall take away.